Hello, welcome back. Are you getting used to my virtual presence, internal and external students? I hope so. So today we're going to be talking about software. Last week we talked about hardware. Before that, we talked about sort of utopic ideas of new media, broadly speaking. And today we're going a little bit more in the direction of dystopic ideas. I'm sorry to say, as the semester progresses, it gets increasingly dystopian, and then it ends with dystopian ideas of media tech. I'm sorry, I'm not a happy ending to this course, but whatever. You can make your happy ending through your projects. So today we're going to be talking about the idea of software as not neutral, but as political. And I know that you've had exposure to this idea in Nick Cara's courses, and you're probably sort of undertaking the same discussions in his media platforms course that you're probably taking concurrently to this one. So today we're going to be discussing primarily software and race, and how software might perpetuate and extend racial bias. So from the video you just watched, we can see that this soap dispenser is basically a robot that has software in it, and it was programmed with a bias towards white skin. So robots and software AI are not neutral, and that's the main lesson for this week. And we'll be exploring that from an array of scholarly viewpoints. And I'm going to be talking about the work of three scholars today who are interested in the political messages of algorithms: Safia Noble, Ruha Benjamin, and Jonathan Kahn. And the first two are interested in the political effects of algorithms upon African American communities in the States, but I think that their questions have larger bearings across the world. And I'm using Kahn's discussion of how algorithms in dating apps to explore how software might shape our ideas and experiences of love. So not all software implements algorithms in a decision-making process. Never mind, backtrack. Not all software programs implement algorithms, but algorithms are a basic decision-making process. An algorithm is at an essential level, it's a function that runs another function in coding, as the examples sort of discussed here kind of all sort of implement. So Noble starts with an example of what happens when she Googles black girls. And Google gives her a stream of pornographic websites and obscenities. And she uses this as an example to ask some questions. And you might think, well, that's just a reflection of our society, and Google should show whatever that reflection is. However, in remaining passive, Noble argues that we participate in reinscribing racist and sexist ideas. That is, it is Google's responsibility to alter those results if they are problematic. And since the publication of her book, Algorithms of Oppression, Google has actually kind of altered the results of that search. So if you search black girls now on Google, you get a very different set of results. And Noble argues for the responsibilities of media companies to make sure that the content they are providing is mindful and accurate. And she writes about the bias of software as being a new form of Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow in American history was racial segregations of space and institutions that happened up until the 1960s. So you couldn't just go to any movie theater as a black person. You had to go to a black movie theater because most movie theaters were whites only. Or you couldn't just go to a public toilet and use it because the public toilet was whites only. You had to go to a black public toilet. And this starts to kind of be deregulated in the 1960s and afterwards. But a lot of scholars say that it remains in sort of various shapes and forms, primarily through the criminal justice system, where, a third of African American men spend some time in jail. So scholars have argued that this is a kind of a new form of racial segregation through criminal justice. And I know the same arguments have been sort of circulated or applied to Australia, where there's a disproportionately high representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in jail. So Ruha Benjamin writes that the new Jim Crow is the, quote, employment of new technologies that reflect and reproduce existing inequalities, but that are promoted and perceived as more objective or progressive than the discriminatory systems of a previous era. Adding that the animating force of the new Jim Crow code is that tech designers encode judgments into technical systems that claim that the racist results of their designs are entirely exterior to the encoding process. So Ruha Benjamin is focused on the makers of software, but there are a host of different parties at play here that I'd like to unpack in these problematic examples. And there are three kind of responsible dynamics in something that sort of results in Black girls being affiliated with pornographic websites almost exclusively. So there's the makers of the algorithm. So Google is not a publicly shared space. It's a privately owned search engine that is paid for by monetizing and tracking your interactions with it, as well as inserting paid advertisements into your searches. It is not a public service. It is not a public square. It is not a shared space where everyone is equal. It is not a neutral actor in our lives. It will, for example, redirect traffic to mainstream news sources as opposed to smaller news sources. So these are not neutral decisions. And Ruha Benjamin and Safia Noble both talk about a particular case that happened in 2015, whereby Google Image labeled African Americans as gorillas. Now, how does something so awful happen? It's because the training set for the AI was overwhelmingly white, much like the racist soap dispenser. And Benjamin criticizes, moreover, Google's response to this issue. Google merely changed it so that the algorithm could no longer recognize gorillas, rather than retraining it with a wider sort of data set. And Benjamin argues that even within this decision, there are racial biases at play, with tech companies wanting quick fixes rather than more difficult structural change. So how do you change this dynamic, these sort of search result issues that discriminate against people of color? Benjamin writes about design thinking and how it should be more comprehensively adopted in more thorough ways than it is at present. And I'm sure that you've encountered design thinking at various points in your comms degree, probably most prominently in my course, 1140, and in Sky Doherty's course. And design thinking involves a few different stages: empathizing with who you're designing for, defining the problem, ideating or creating sort of response, prototyping it, and then testing it. But Benjamin writes that we have to kind of be conscious of what happens at each stage. And she writes, as we think about coded inequality, inequity, and discriminatory design, it is vital to question which humans are being prioritized in this process. And she paraphrases scholars Dana Boyd and MC Elish in sort of insisting that three critical questions be asked in the process of AI design. And they are: what are the unintended consequences of designing systems at scale on the basis of existing patterns in society? When and how should AI systems prioritize individuals over society and vice versa? And when is introducing an AI system the right answer and when is it not? And in particular, I think the last question gets glossed over in a lot of sort of design thinking that apply sort of digital technology. So that's one sort of major actor at play. And some people, the makers of algorithms and designers of algorithms, and these are some scholar suggestions for how that process can be done in a more conscientious way. The other sort of dynamic here that might result in sort of unintended discrimination in sort of our algorithmic world is the corporate and governmental users of the algorithm. So Noble adds here that there is an additional bias embedded in Google through large organizations who can engage in a power play to ensure that their website appears first in the search results. So the pornography industry is one of the most skilled at altering Google searches through a tactic called long tail keywords. So there's a base combo like MILF sex, and then the long tail version would be black MILF sex, resulting in ever more niche markets. So when you search for the base tail, the long tails pop up underneath it. And the pornography industry iterates this for every possible combo, thus increasing their visibility in Google searches. So non-porn related, the Googleification of our culture even reaches us academics. So when publishers are kind of talking to us about publishing our book, they will suggest changes of the book title in order to make it more Google friendly. Another example of the complex dynamic between software and governmental/corporate users of technology comes in the form of policing. So crime predictive softwares like Predpol give police up-to-date data tracking crime in certain neighborhoods with a prediction of where crime is supposed to occur that day. So these, of course, are heavily concentrated in Black neighborhoods and contribute to a misunderstanding of crime and de-emphasis of some crime like domestic violence over others that are racially coded. So Benjamin makes the case that the data input into the police system is racially coded to begin with police proclivities to stopping and frisking Black men in far greater instances than other races. So this already skewed data then feeds into a system that delivers an obviously skewed result. And Benjamin refers to this as a prioritization of efficiency over equity. And that might be the major criticism landed here against sort of underthought and undercooked algorithmic design, is a predilection for efficiency over social equity. So in terms of Predpol, this AI delivers a very unnuanced look at crime, one that does not take into consideration white crime or domestic violence that is endemic to all races and income levels. It is also unconcerned with the systemic contributions to why certain crime tends to be concentrated in Black neighborhoods like poverty, food and job deserts, and under-resourced health services and schools. So the software doesn't care, and it doesn't afford to look at the whole picture, which has to play a part in the criminal justice system, Benjamin would argue. The third dynamic here is the general users of algorithms. So not the makers, not the corporate users, but day-to-day users like us. And of course, there's a human element of voting that determines which websites appear first. Thus, we are perhaps missing the human element of the algorithm and algorithmic living here by attributing traits like neutrality and publicness to our most commonly used software. A pronounced example of the human elements is Google bombing, whereby users intentionally alter the search results by repeatedly linking on certain websites to draw certain unrelated topic areas that appear in the search results. So, for one example, is when popular sex columnist Dan Savage invited his readers to Google bomb an avid anti-gay politician, Senator Rick Santorum, in order to make certain sex acts appear when you Googled for Santorum's name. In addition to sort of Google bombing as being a dynamic here, Google's decisions to censor some results and not others are not neutral or arbitrary, but reflect embedded social ideologies. For example, Google chooses to censor animal abuse, but not blackface. Noble argues that the white, masculinist, anti-identity politics culture of Silicon Valley is partly to blame for these skewed decisions. She writes, understanding technological racialization as a particular form of algorithmic oppression allows us to use it as an important framework in which to critique the discourse of the internet as a democratic landscape and to deploy alternative thinking about the practices instantiated within commercial web search. So she's sort of painting a dynamic between users and makers of the algorithm here and how they sort of interconnect. Noble argues that none of these dynamics and decision makers are neutral because people are not neutral. We are products of our social contexts and their histories, and the search results for Black girls fall within a longer history of the sexualization of Black women's bodies. So this is sort of attributing responsibility to users of Google, to makers of the algorithm, and to anyone else who interfaces with that tool. So she traces this sexualization of Black women, this cultural sexualization of Black women, back to examples like the Hottentot Venus, a South African woman named Sarah Baartman, who was enslaved and exhibited in the late 18th, early 19th century in theme parks, science and medical lectures, and sideshows in circuses as an example of a curvy Black woman with a large buttocks. When she died, her brain, skeleton, and sex organs were placed on display in Paris until they were repatriated and buried in 1974. So grisly, unpleasant story, right? But it goes to show that the sexualization of Black women's bodies exists within a larger imperialist history that we have to kind of be mindful of when Google search pops up with, sex sites when we search for Black girls. That is a product of users, but it's more accurately a product of a kind of a cultural context that is the product of a larger history. The point is that Google search results affixed to Black femininity are lockstep in a larger history of sexualization and objectification of Black women. It's the digital era equivalent of what happened to Sarah Baartman. So we have to ask, what are our responsibilities when it comes to these patterns? Do we sit back and let them happen, or do we try to shape that history? It seems rather arbitrary that Google will censor and change Google will censor and change some things and not others. So a more consistent set of principles needs to be established here in order to make these changes, as well as diversification of the people working on algorithms. So in light of all of this rather sad, all of this negative stuff, in the next activity, I would like you to place in a descriptor or a label that refers to you or a friend, and to Google search it or Google image search it and see what pops up, and sort of see how that makes you feel, or see if it's an accurate portrayal of who you are. And if you don't feel comfortable with, including the sort of search results or discussing it in the next forum, just do it on the side and see what happens, and then sort of reflect on it in the context of these dynamics, which include the users of algorithms, the governmental and corporate sort of users who are kind of sculpting these search results.